On behalf of Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, the Climate Change and the Environment in the Arab World Program, I'd like to welcome you to our first lecture today, which we are very happy to present to you the work done by Dr. Shihadeh and Dr. Najat Saliba and their team of researchers. This work started out, I believe, in 2010, and the resulting study is titled Effect of Distributed Electric Power Generation on Household Exposure to Airborne Carcinogens, an Unintended Consequence of Supply-Side Electric Power Reduction Measures in Poorly Regulated Environments. We at the Environment and the Climate Change and the Environment Program in the Arab world, what we're trying to do is try to accompany scientific development and take whatever science work is being done and translate that into something that policymakers can make use of and present as policies to be implemented. There's a large gap that has been often spoken of this issue, where we have good science, but that good science is never translated into something that people can make use of. So this is where we see our role. We have set out our program for the coming few years at the Climate Change Program to look at two areas in specific. One is transportation and the other is in agriculture, and as they relate to climate change. And what is being done, what is being presented today falls within, if you will, the realm of air pollution generated by diesel engines, and this happens to be power generation and engines rather than vehicular engines. And the lecture today that Dr. Shihadeh is going to be presenting is a distillation of the study, the technical study that they have done, and it's entitled Electric Power Rationing and Diesel Generators in Beirut is Cancer in the Air. And I will not take too long now, and I'll introduce to you Dr. Shihadeh. He's the primary investigator on this. Dr. Shihadeh is a professor of mechanical engineering and directs AUB's Aerosol Research Laboratory. He has published numerous studies on the properties and health effects of airborne particles. The co-PI on this study is Dr. Najat Saliba, who is a professor of chemistry at AUB. She is an expert in analytical chemistry and supervises the Atmospheric and Analytical Laboratory at AUB, and is also now the director of the Nature Conservation Center, formerly IBSAR. So without taking too much time, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Shihadeh.
Thank you, Nadeem. And is my microphone on? Can you guys hear me okay? No? Where is our audio? No, just this one. Okay. All right. Well, I'll speak into the microphone in that case. Thank you, Nadeem, for inviting me to give this talk. I'd like to, again, acknowledge my co-author, Najat Saliba, who's sitting in the front row. You can direct all the difficult questions to her. I'd also like to, before I do the other acknowledgments, I'll mention quickly what I'm going to cover today. First of all, what is the purpose of this study? What is air pollution? It's a crash course on air pollution. Thank you. Why might diesel generators be a concern? Closer. How can we find out if they are a concern? And what is the size of the problem? I mean, that's the main question here. And do diesel generators add significantly to the pollution that we breathe every day? Are they important? And what are some recommendations for action? Okay, there are my acknowledgments. So I'd like to acknowledge people who volunteered for this study, some of whom I think are here in the audience today. They volunteered their balconies while we were doing measurements. The graduate student who did his thesis on this, Mark Al-Halo. Undergraduate students who did their final year project, they're named here. They assisted in this project as well. And the research staff, Azza Jarudi and Elizabeth Sepajian, who's also here in the audience. And of course, funding support from the Issam Faris Institute. And it's good to be among many friends here. And I'd also like to acknowledge my students who just tolerated a lecture in thermodynamics and are willing to hear me again for a second hour in a row, that are here in the audience. So what is the purpose of this study? Well, here you can see some photographs of what we call primary emissions. So, of course, we're all familiar with these sites. These are something that we see every day in Beirut. We have traffic jams, or we have a lot of cars emitting. We have construction sites all over the place. And, of course, we have ubiquitous diesel generators everywhere. The main concern of this study was, well, given the background, given how dirty our background is, actually, do these really add something significant to what we breathe every day? That's the driving question. And the reason we were interested in that question is to say, well, this might be one more reason why we would want to fix our electric power sector. So as many of you know, or all of you know, the electric power in Beirut is cut 3 hours a day, and outside of Beirut it's cut for many more than 3 hours a day on a rotating basis due to limited production capacity by EDL. So as a result, most people get power during outages from a diesel generator like this. So does private power production significantly increase our exposure to hazardous air pollutants? And our approach was to compare airborne pollutant levels when diesel generators were on and when they're off. That's the basic approach, and there's a lot more complexity to it than that, but that's the basic idea. Please feel free to interrupt me at any point if you have a question. So before we go into that, we need to talk a little bit about what is air pollution, so we're all on the same page. Is there a question? No. All right, so the first thing we should discuss are what are called primary emissions. And I've added burning tires to that because those have been an important source of emission as well. And if you actually calculate the amount of toxics produced per kilogram of material burned, burning tires are 3 orders of magnitude worse than just about anything else. Now, of course, we're not breathing burning tires every day, all day long. So they don't necessarily add up to a significant burden in terms of what we inhale every day. But I listed them. So those are primary emissions. The port in Beirut is also a very significant source of emissions for us. So I've shown one example there of a ship that's burning diesel fuel and emitting heavily into our morning air. So these primary emissions, they include, these are some of the constituents. These are example constituents in the primary emissions. They include gas phase materials that are famous due to global warming, like CO2, carbon monoxide, SO2, nitric oxide. Those are all in the gas phase. And as we go down that list, we go to heavier and heavier materials that tend to exist more in the particle phase. So when we say a particle, we mean some either solid or liquid that's suspended in the air that we can breathe in. So we have a range of materials. Many of them are toxic, such as heavy metals and polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which cause cancer. There are at least 400 or more specific compounds in the exhaust fumes of engines that are burning various fuels. So this is just an abbreviated list. And I also point out to the, again, more volatile and less volatile materials. We'll come back to why that's important. So this is a picture, a model. I don't know if you can actually, you can't see all the nuances, but there are what we call primary particles, and they have a core of what we refer to as non-volatile particulate matter. So this would be something like elemental carbon, the soot, the black soot that you see coming out of a diesel engine. Well, that soot particle, unfortunately due to this graphic is not shown, might be coated by something that's less volatile, some of these that may exist as liquids that are coating that particle. So that particle becomes kind of a vehicle for when we breathe in, we breathe that particle, the carbon itself may not be so harmful from a health perspective, but the material that is carried by the carbon that's coating the carbon is inhaled and leads to all kinds of health effects. So, yeah, again, it's difficult to see, but the coating that's around that particle, when the emissions get diluted by air, they mix with air, they evaporate, and they leave a large fraction of what was coating the particle becomes in the gas phase. And when it's in the gas phase, it's available for reaction under the influence of sunlight, what we call photochemistry, atmospheric aging and photochemistry, and that forms new particles that weren't originally in the exhaust at the start. And the mass of these particles can be actually larger than what was originally emitted in the exhaust. So when we talk about air pollution, we're interested in the total effect from what's emitted initially to what gets created within a day. This is typically a time period of 1 day span. So by the afternoon, we would have secondary organic aerosols that were formed from the primary ones. Najat should correct me if I'm saying anything wrong because she's the expert in this domain. So we start with those primary emissions, and then we end up with something that looks like this by the end of the day, where we have a whole fog or smog over the city of Beirut. In fact, you see that in the morning as well. All right, so air pollution, what is it? It's primary and secondary particles and gases. And when we talk about particles, we need to mention something about the particle size. So this is a human hair follicle. And there are two common designations for particle sizes in air pollution, what's called PM10 and PM2.5. PM10 means particles that are smaller than 10 micrometers in diameter. So you could fit about 5 or 6 of them across the diameter of a single hair. And then PM2.5 is particles smaller than 2.5 micrometers. And again, you could fit 4 of those across a single PM10 particle. Well, where does diesel exhaust fit in this? So those are those same two redrawn to scale. And there's the diesel exhaust particle. So we're talking about something that's a nanoparticle, much smaller even than what is typically of concern in ambient air pollution measurements. So if we zoomed in on that particle, this particle here, we zoom in on it. This is an artist's rendition of what is a diesel exhaust particle. Again, you see that it's got a core of carbon spheres, and it's coated by organic compounds, which are the main ones of concern from a cancer and health perspective. And also you see a cloud of nucleated vapors. These are liquid particles that are surrounding the exhaust particle. Also of importance from a health perspective are metals that could be embedded on the surface of this carbon. So in our study, we were mainly concerned with this green stuff, okay, the condensed polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which are a main source of cancer in inhaled cigarette smoke, in inhaled diesel exhaust, and other combustion processes. Some properties of diesel exhaust particles, well, just this past June, they were finally moved from a suspected carcinogen to a known carcinogen by IARC, the WHO International Agency for Research on Cancer. So now these are listed as class 1 known human carcinogens. Are they a concern? Well, this is a very interesting study. This is probably the most famous, a graph from the most famous study on the health effects of air pollution ever done. There was a prospective study of 8,000 people living in 6 U.S. cities from 1972 to 1988 or something like that, about a 15-year follow-up period. And they traced what happens to these people after 15 years. How many of them that were living at the beginning of the study are still living at the end of the 15-year period? And they looked at that as a function of how much pollution was in the air in the cities that they lived in. So each one of these letters here corresponds to the name of a city in the United States. And on the horizontal axis is the PM2.5, which you now know what it is. So this is the concentration of ambient air pollution. And this is the mortality rate ratio. So relative to the cleanest city, how many more deaths were there in the other cities as a function of the air pollution level? So what you can see is an astounding correlation. I mean, it's hard to get experimental lab data like this, much less data with actual people living in cities over 15 years. So we could see that basically the higher the pollution level, the higher the mortality rate ratio. So and the main cause of death in those cases was cardiopulmonary disease and lung cancer. That graph has been cited in more than 40,000 academic publications. So it's a very influential study, and it has led to a lot of research since then. Beirut, Najat Saliba's data tells us Beirut is around here. And this is important to mention that this is background air pollution, urban background measurements. So when we look at the PM 2.5 levels in Beirut in a location which is far from any source of pollution, so this would be, for example, on the roof of this building, far from any diesel generator, far from any road, these are the levels that we would measure. And the same was true for the other studies where they do the measurements. Those are called urban background measurements. Now, diesel generators are not an urban background phenomenon. Those generators tend to be local. Their effects tend to be local. If you live near the generator or where the exhaust is of the generator, then you tend to breathe much higher levels of air pollution than what is in the background. But this just gives us some perspective. All right, so we saw that there are cardiovascular effects. There are many effects listed here. They're centered around the concept of inflammation, and they affect the heart, the lungs, the blood, the vasculature. They affect the heart, the nervous system's ability to control your heartbeat. It affects there are many effects of these, and I can't go into them all here. But there are known pathways for how we get from exposure to air pollution to mortality and other health effects. More recently, so cardiovascular effects have been the main source of, have been the main research topic on air pollution. More recently, people have started looking at neurological effects on the brain. And, traditionally it was thought that the brain is affected by air pollution because of the downstream effects from what's happening in the lung. But more recent research is showing that actually the brain is exposed directly to inhaled pollutants as well. For example, through the olfactory bulb, you can breathe in nanoparticles, and those can go directly to the brain without passing through the lung at all. And this is a complicated chart that kind of shows how air pollutants can come to the brain by direct exposure. Some recent studies on this. This one was published in 2011. It showed in rats that were exposed to ambient air pollution the effect on neurons. You can see this is a healthy one, and this is one that's been collapsed. And they looked at the effect of air pollution on collapsed, intact, and viable neurons in the brains of these rats that had been exposed for 10 weeks to ambient air pollution, a higher concentration, of course, than what we typically breathe. So there were clear effects there. And there's also epidemiological research on this. This is a study just published in Environmental Health Perspectives, where they were looking at child behavior at 6 and 7 years of age as a function of exposure of the mother when she was pregnant. So they looked at markers of PAH in the cord blood after the birth, and then tracked at the age of 6 and 7 what are the behavioral problems associated. Are there behavioral problems associated with these higher PAH levels? So high prenatal pH exposure, whether characterized by air monitoring or maternal cord adducts, was positively associated with symptoms anxious, depressed, and attention problems. And then we also have a very recent study came out a month ago, which shows that there's also a correlation between brain tumors, childhood brain tumors, which is the main source of death in children who get cancer, and parental occupational exposure to diesel exhaust. And there's a proposed mechanism, which is that there are genetic mechanisms, epigenetics. The DNA of the parent can be damaged and passed on to the child. When the child is born, it already has a head start on cancer. So these are all very problematic things. So we come back to the question, are diesel generators a concern? And the answer is yes, if there are enough of them operating for long enough. And so that's where we come to our study. The first step in our study was to do a building-by-building survey of an area of Hamra. Okay, and it's bracketed here in red. My undergraduate students who were doing their final year project, they went to each building and inspected the generator in the building, got data on its size, its fuel consumption, its age, its maintenance record, and the height of the stack. Some of the results are shown here. These are basically, each one of these red circles is a diesel generator. The size of the circle illustrates how many kilovolt amp, the size of the generator basically. The color of the circle indicates how much fuel is consumed at that site. And so, and also the height of the length of this line corresponds to the height of the stack, the exhaust stack. So they surveyed 184 buildings in that area, which is all the buildings actually, one by one. There were 109 diesel generators in those 184 buildings, which is about 60% of the buildings having a generator. And the average diesel engine power was less than 150 kilovolt amps, kVA. Back of the envelope economics, we could, if we use the reported fuel consumption of all of these generators, it was 136,000 liters a month of fuel. If we multiply that by the going rate of the price of fuel, that's about $120,000 a month for those 3 hours of electricity provision in that small area. And if you compare that to the price of the same amount of electricity if it had been purchased from EDL, you get direct losses of $75,000 a month in additional expenses to those 184 buildings that were surveyed. So that's actually substantial. I mean, if you consider that that's per month and you could do something with that money other than put it out the stack. So coming to our study design, we monitored ambient air pollutants continuously while monitoring the state of nearby generators over multiple power outage episodes. So we had a box, I'll show it to you here, which had basically this instrument which measures polyaromatic hydrocarbons that are condensed on particles. And this instrument is operating continuously, 24 hours a day, maybe for 15 days on a given balcony, and we're logging the signal that it's measuring. We're continuously monitoring what is the level in the air. At the same time, we're measuring the power cuts that are happening. Okay, so every time the power goes out, we log that event, and every time the power comes back on, we log that event, and that's all done automatically. So we have a record of what is the PAH level in the air relative to the state of the generators in that building. We don't need to worry about all the technical details here.
Can I ask you?
Yes, please.
How did you decide which balcony to use to put that marker? What went into the decision?
So we recruited by word of mouth and by email people that would be interested. So this is really a convenience sample. People that would be interested. And they determined, when they would answer our ad and say, yes, we'd like to host your generator, they would tell us where to put it, which balcony to put it on. So there was no selection by us of where to put it.
Okay, so I'm sure you ran some background check to see if where you put the device, the amount of pollution would be different than, let's say, in a place in AUB you mentioned college or whatever.
Absolutely.
Was there any difference as a background?
Yes, we'll come to that. So each site has its own background because one site might be close to a road, one site might be far away from a road. So by the study design, by comparing what the levels of the pH are when the generator is operating and when it's not operating, there's an internal background within each site.
So each site is its own control?
Each site is its own control, exactly. I'll get more into the methodology. There was another question, I think. Yes?
Why did you put something inside to make a comparison of how much was inside?
Yeah, we just found that it was, well, we only had one of these devices to work with at a time. And we were also concerned that there are indoor sources as well of pHs. So if someone smokes at home, if someone is cooking, etc. So we really focused on outdoor air rather than indoor air. So there were typically 15 days were sampled at each site, and this happened between January 2010 and January 2012. And we computed the attributable fraction of ambient carcinogens to diesel generators. Seen this. One note, I think everyone is familiar, that power is rationed only from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. In Hamra, in the Beirut area, for 4 3-hour daily rotating intervals. So it could be out from 6 to 9 a.m., 9 to 12, 12 to 3, or 3 to 6, and then it keeps rotating. So this is an example from one particular balcony, one 24-hour time period. And this one is a very obvious case. I picked it because it's so obvious. What we see here, the blue line is the PAH concentration in the air. The red line, the first vertical red line, is when the power first went out. And this is the second outage when they're switching back. So you can see a very clear signal as a result of the diesel generator coming on at this particular location on that particular day. Now, of course, this is affected by wind direction. It's affected by many things. But this just gives you an idea of the kind of data that we would get. Here's a little bit more complicated case. There's a clear rise when the generator comes on, but there's also a lot of PAH throughout the rest of the day. So how do we deal with that complexity when we determine what is the added contribution of the local generator and what is the added contribution of more distant generators? So it's possible, for example, the power went out from 6 to 9 in this location, and one street over, now the power was out from 9 to 12. So maybe part of this signal is also due to a diesel generator that's operating on another time schedule. Ahmad?
That's also the time when Beirut is full of cars.
Yes, absolutely. So we're going to account for all of that. So I'm just giving you a sense of what the difficulties are in interpreting the data, and then I'll tell you how we did it.
Did you measure the distance between the generator and your measurement device?
Yeah, we did document that, but it's not actually accounted for directly in this. Okay. So I need to introduce the concept of exposure. Exposure is the average air concentration times the time that you're breathing in. Okay, so if we take that blue line and we multiply it by the time, we get the total amount of exposure over a day. So there's an equation there, the integral of C dt. And the units are nanograms per meter cubed times hours. So graphically, it's just the area under this curve. That's the exposure. That's what we mean by the exposure. So what part of this exposure is due to diesel generators? And we give that the symbol EG in red up there. We'd like to know how much of this blue area came from diesel generators, whether they're our own diesel generator or our neighbor's diesel generator. That's the question. So we divided this up into several zones. First of all, we know that outside of 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., none of this is due to diesel generators. So 100% of this and this is due to everything other than diesel generators. The area that's in yellow has to do with when our own generator was on. And the area in red is an area which is affected both by background as well as potentially other generators. So we have these three different kinds of areas that we need to sum to get the total exposure. And we referred to those as E3, E9, and E off. So if the power is off for 3 hours a day, that's when your diesel generator is on. We called that E3. We called this E9 the other 9 hours that other generators might be on. And E off is the exposure when no generators are on. And by the way, this is the best time to do exercise outside. Best time to breathe. Okay. So the attributable fraction then is just the exposure due to the generators divided by the total exposure. And we can find a relationship. We did a lot of mathematical modeling as a function of the average distance and number of generators in other time zones. We did a survey. And also computing particle dispersion patterns. So taking into account, and I'm not going to show you any of the details here because there's not time or interest probably. Okay, so we ran a computational fluid mechanics model of how air flows over and between buildings. We took the Lebanese army map of Hamra and we digitized it and we put it into a mathematical model where we computed the airflow and we put generators at various locations in there. So we could get a sense of how much, as you go away from a given generator, how does the concentration of the pollutant vary in space. We combined that with our survey, which we had done, since we know now where all the generators are, and we could get what's called the radius of impact. So we could understand how far are you impacted by other generators, and it turns out to be around 200 meters. For the wind conditions, we also had to input the wind conditions on a daily basis. We combined that with a map provided of the electrical power network by EDL. We went to EDL and we got the map of the Hamra neighborhood, and we had each substation and the lines that are served by it, and we know the schedules. So we were able to input that also to know that within 200 meters, how likely are you to be affected by generators on other time zones? Okay? So we ran simulation. We ran around 10,000 simulations with this, and we got a relationship finally between E3 and E9 that we got a theoretical relationship that we could use to determine the total exposure due to other own and other generators. These are some example results that we had. So this is pH concentration in the air between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. at the 15 sites. And what you see are the levels with the generator on and the levels when they're off. So in light blue is when they're off, in dark blue is when they're on. And you can see that for every site, always the levels when the generator is on are higher. We could average all the data and turn it into an average day in Hamra by taking all of the sites over those 300 days and representing them hour by hour, taking the average. So we would get this red line here. So this is what, on average, the air would look like in Hamra. So we have the time and we have the concentration. And you can see that when generators come on and when traffic hits in the morning, the pollution levels spike. And they start to come down as and we expect that from air pollution meteorology. As the ground heats up, more of the air is mixed, and so the concentrations tend to come down. And then again, you have a steep drop at 6 p.m. when the generators go off. If we subtract out those 3-hour periods where your own generator is on, you would get the blue line. So this would approximate, let's say you and your friends agree on not using generators, this would approximate your exposure, the blue line, in your own neighborhood if you turned them off, but all the other neighborhoods kept them on. Okay.
Sorry?
Yes?
Actually, I'm surprised at this steep drop. Where do the particles go? When you turn it off, immediately it goes down in the air?
Yeah, well, there's constant mixing of the air from wind, and so as soon as you stop introducing more particles, the air cleans out the concentration. Okay. We checked I didn't mention this before, but we had a way of checking that our instrument, which is an indirect measurement of pHs, is actually giving reasonable results by comparing how much pH was trapped on a filter and then measuring it using standard analytical chemistry techniques. And we found that we had good correlation for the sum of the pHs as well as individual pHs between the instrument that we were using and the true measurements. So this is where we get to the final results, basically. If we compute the background level over 24 hours, it turns out to be around 20 nanograms per meter cubed. When your own generator is on, it goes up to 73. And the contribution due to other generators is 35. So during the other part of those 12 hours, this is the average concentration. So we can compute the resulting daily exposure. The resulting daily exposure from the background is 480 nanogram hours per meter cubed, compared to around 290 if we sum the local generators and other generators. I wanted to mention, I'll come back to that in a second. So this amount here is about 40% of the total. It represents about 40% of the total inhaled carcinogens in the air are coming from either your own generator or a generator that's in another time zone. So that actually is an astounding number because it's only for 3 hours a day. 3 hours a day is accounting for 40% of what we breathe, or it's increasing our exposure by about 60%. If we calculate the benzopyrene component of the PAH, it's about the equivalent exposure to 1 to 2 cigarettes a day. Now, if we compare these numbers here, to an indoor area where tobacco smoke is happening, of course, they're much lower still. So, I mean, we often hear the argument that why are we worried about indoor air pollution from tobacco smoke when our outdoor air is so polluted? Well, actually, we have to worry about both of them. They're both very significant. So the results in context, I mentioned this, 40% of the exposure is due to generators which operate only 3 hours a day. And it would be proportionally higher in other areas where the period of electric outage is longer. And I'll mention it also in the context of the public smoking ban, Law 174. If we did some computations of dose of PAHs inhaled on a daily basis. And this is the order in which they're important. Secondhand smoke prior to Law 174 was still a more important source of inhaled carcinogens than anything else. But close behind are automotive traffic and diesel generators, and they're of similar magnitude. They're very close, actually. So our recommendations then, of course, are to increase EDL's production capacity. There's really no excuse in a country like this to not have the national power supplier producing electricity. It's cheaper for everyone in the short run. As you saw, the fuel costs are very high. It's also much cheaper in the long run when we're going to be dealing with medical and other losses. And it's an easy one because there's no resident in Lebanon who would be against the electric power company. It's unlike the tobacco control law. This is a much easier battle to fight. So everyone would agree with that. We also had reviewed the air pollution regulations and enforcement mechanisms in Lebanon, and it turns out that there's actually nothing whatsoever governing these private diesel generators. There are regulations for generators that are above 500 kVA, and those regulations are actually embarrassing if you read them. They say that either a stack needs to reach a certain height, or the amount of pollutants in that stack should be below some threshold. And that's unheard of anywhere in the world as far as I'm concerned. And again, there are no regulations for generators that are smaller than 500 kVA. So that's the presentation. I'd be happy with Najat to answer any questions that you might have. I believe there were two in the back first. Yes, Jad? Chris.
Sir, I wanted to ask you, what are the constraints for implementing better production capacity? Like
that's beyond my
what the constraints are. Perhaps the person sitting next to you with the question has a better idea. Jad.
Yeah, I can hint at some answer. I want to ask you a question. When emission.
Yes.
So this is the one that includes the car, maybe the traffic emission.
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So this is what we're breathing on average 24 hours a day due to everything other than generators.
And do you have evidence, I mean, I guess maybe that's a question also for Najat, that the benzene emissions combined with the diesel emissions would create a different set of diseases than the PPAH alone? I mean, are there evidence of a combined effect, or you can really separate out what comes from diesel and what comes from benzene?
There are, in terms of health effects, I mean, most of the health effect studies are they do two things. Either they use urban air and expose
those cells to it, or people, or they use diesel exhaust particulate matter as a surrogate for urban air pollution. I mean, those are the main two ways that studies are done. So there's no one, I mean, there is knowledge of specific chemical exposure and their health effects, but those tend not to be, those are used more in an occupational exposure setting rather than a residential setting. There was a question.
Yeah. One, going back to the automotive load, did you compare weekends, like Sunday versus weekdays? And then the other question is specific areas like near AUB and C. Was there a higher background than the rest? Or
okay.
Were there major variations, or this is an average? Right? What was the range of this background?
The range was quite large. I mean, we're talking about many standard deviations. So we would have averages around 100 and averages around 250, and anywhere in that range. Now, we hesitated, and we actually, by the study design, it wouldn't be valid to compare one site to another because we only had one pollution monitor working at a time. So at each site, you're capturing
particular weather conditions, what the emissions would have been. So the study is not designed in a way to give us sensitivity to differences across sites. We noticed, for example, at one site, when the wind is blowing in one direction, the levels were unbelievably high, and when it was blowing in another direction, they were unmeasurable from the. So we know it's very much affected by the weather patterns.
And again, the weekend issue versus the weekend.
Sundays were always less polluted than other days of the week. It was very clear. I don't have the data shown here, but I've looked at it, yes.
I mean, it'd be interesting to know what, I mean, with the generators are constant even on the weekend, right?
Not always. Actually, the shortages on Sundays were quite a bit less than shortages on other days. There were some measured shortages on Sundays, but most often the generators were not coming on Sunday.
And anything about summer versus winter?
Winter tended to be higher than summer. Winter tended to be higher than summer. Yeah. For PAHs, it's higher because the PAHs we're measuring particle-bound PAHs, and they, when the weather is colder, they condense more on the particles that we're measuring. So, Alec.
There's one thing that was mentioned at the beginning, which is the height of the stack.
Yes.
And so we see around the city generators having different length of these pipes. So do these things make a difference actually? So if I have a stack that goes all the way to the top of the building and releases the gases up there, do they come back? How do they diffuse?
Yeah, they do come back. I mean,
it does help to have the stacks higher. Now, what we noticed is that about 90% of the stacks were to the top of the building. Almost all of them were to the top of the building. We did some simulations where we changed the stack height across the board. And the differences were not so large. And the reason is that there's due to the turbulence of the air passing over the buildings, there's a very strong downmixing pattern. So you may not get exposed to your own exhaust pipe if your exhaust goes to the top, but you might get the one from 3 buildings over. So it wasn't a huge impact. It was an impact, but not a huge one. Yes?
Are there any precautions people can take? I mean, an air filter at home, does that help in the house? Or
look, I have 3 air filters at home where my children sleep. But I have no evidence to say that they actually help. I mean, I haven't seen yet a robust set of studies in the literature that would suggest that there are actually different health outcomes. But it can't hurt, as long as it doesn't produce ozone. There are air filters, air cleaners, that produce high levels of ozone. So you could be doing some harm, but yeah. Yes.
Recent data, I'm not even environmental. Visiting actually, but there is a lot of recent data about VOC concentrating indoor much higher than, it depends on the really, and then interaction of different VOC and benzene products and that concentrate in the homes even sometimes higher depending on the height and on the where the things so it should be maybe more evaluation, because I've never seen any kind of engine generator in any city or any country as much as this. And I'm sure the homes, if they're not tested, many of them will turn out to be quite concentrated. And
هل تم دراسة أنواع الفلاتر ممكن يكون مستخدم بالمولدات؟ خصوصا أن نحن نعرف دراسات قديما عملت على الفلاتر المستخدم بقطاع نقل السيارات، وتبين أنه أحسن أنواع الفلاتر استخدمت في النقل الديزل وزغلت الجزيئات الطريقي صارت أخطر على الصحة من ما كانت قبل. فهل إنه تم دراسة أنواع الفلاتر المستخدمة ومراجعه المعايير اللي حطتها المفترض حطتها وزاره البيئه مع بلديات تعمل يمشوا هالمولدات ويحطوا لهم هذا في يسمى كاتب الصوت ايش تاثيره بان الموضوع كان عم يزيد ولا عم ينقص ولا انبعاثات بتطلع من الحراريات. هل تم دراسه انواع الديزل المستخدمه؟ لانه في عندنا اليوم في ديزل عم تجيبه الدوله، في ديزل عم تجيبه مباشره من الشركات،
وفي ديزل عم بيجي تقريبا يعني في كذا نوع من الديزل بيستخدم كان بالنقل او بتوليد الطاقه، فكمان تم الاعتبار بهالانواع المختلفه. شكرا.
Thank you, Habib, for the question, the difficult question.
There is evidence that modern diesel engines pollute less than many of the uncontrolled diesel engines that we're using. But as you mentioned, the new technologies have produced higher levels of nanoparticles, smaller particles that are emitted by the engine than the old technologies. So you don't see them visibly as much. And there is a lot of research now on the question of whether they're actually better in terms of health outcomes, and it's not clear that they're better. So as an engineer, I would feel very reluctant to recommend anything with respect to the technology for the diesel engines. For sure, the best thing is to get rid of the diesel engines altogether, like you did with in the transportation sector. I mean, I think that was the best thing, because you also don't know what happens in 10 years after the diesel engine's been used, if it's not maintained properly, etc. There are many, many issues that come up with respect to that. With respect to fuel specifications, the Lebanese fuel specifications are very poor. I mean, the European and North American standards are orders of magnitude better. Their sulfur levels in the fuel in the US are in the level of ppm, parts per million. And in Lebanon, they're percentages. So we're talking about 4 orders of magnitude higher sulfur in our fuel than what is allowed, even in farm machinery. Farm machinery has better fuel than our transport fuel. Farm machinery outside has better. So those are issues, they could be addressed. Would they make a big difference for PAH? The thing that we were measuring, I think they wouldn't actually make a big difference. They would make a difference for SO2 and acid rain and some other things, which are not actually the major problems in Beirut. SO2 is not our major problem. Would you agree with that, Najat? Would you like to sit up here, please? Please. There was someone who, yes?
I was just wondering concerning weather conditions, whether they compared days with thermal inversions. Because Beirut seems to be, having thermal inversions, especially in the spring and the summer. So I thought maybe during thermal inversions, I would have expected that the level of pollution would be higher because of the trapping of the pollutants near the surface.
We have done that as a separate group. I should mention here, by the way, that this
research and the work of Najat and myself, we're also working in collaboration with a group at the St. Joseph University, and it's called the Associated Air Quality Research Unit under the CNRS umbrella. And in the context of that group, there have been measurements done on days where there were obviously thermal inversions were more intense than other days. And yes, we saw higher levels of pollution on those days. But it was high on, it's never, Najat has plenty of data on this, our air pollution levels never come down to the maximum guideline by WHO. We're always about a factor of 2 higher, about 200% the WHO maximum guidelines for particulate matter in the air across the days. There are some days that it approaches the maximum, but it's always above it. So,
how do we compare to data from other cities that are polluted or crowded?
Najat has done this comparison, not in ppH, but in particulate matter, in ambient air. And total particulate matter, or PM 2.5 or PM 10, we are better than, say, Mumbai, Cairo, Beijing. Those places are about 20 times, or, well, 5 times higher than what we are. Those are the worst cases. Okay, but we're also similar to other cities in the Eastern Mediterranean. Nicosia, maybe Athens, you looked at Athens. So we're in that range. We're in the range of other polluted cities in the Eastern Mediterranean region. We have an air pollution problem in the region as a whole.
Okay.
Yes. So you're not going to. It's not as bad as many other places. It's true.
Did Najat look at anything in the States? Like, what are we compared to?
We cannot say states. Maybe I should.
No, I said
yes.
But a city, like a particular city in the States, a bigger city.
Maybe we're as bad as Los Angeles 20 years ago.
Oh,
20 years ago, not now. Yeah. If that's, yeah. Yes, John, me, or Alan?
Both of you. What do you think of the plan to put ships to produce electricity in front of the coast? I mean, we know that these the ships. I mean, first they have been fined in Afghanistan for not keeping their promises, so it's a financial matter. That's different. But what about the air pollution? We know, and do you know if it pollutes the sea under it? And you said that evidence of they would be burning in front of the coastline with the wind direction. Would we have a worse situation than now?
We measured air pollution in Jemaisi for a while. It was a bit higher than the levels, but we cannot attribute that to the harbor. We're lucky a little bit in Beirut because the air circulates very fast. So we never did a study related to the harbor emission, but I don't know. I don't have an answer.
But my guess, Jad, is that yes. I mean, if we put
400 megawatts of power in the sea in front of Beirut, we will have significantly higher air pollution levels in Beirut because of the sea breeze. I mean, we see it in the morning. You see it, every morning. If you look over the horizon, you see a brown layer, especially on cold mornings, and I think a lot of that is due to the activity in the harbor as well as the Zouk power plant. I mean, ideally, what should be done is a simulation of air patterns over the country, and a power plant should be located in a place to minimize what's called the inhaled fraction. So there's a common metric in air pollution literature is for every kilogram of a certain pollutant produced, how many grams are inhaled by people. So there you cross population with weather patterns to optimize the location of those.
Just to comment on that, I think the ships are going to.
Electricity is being produced now because that's where the connections are.
They're not going to be in either they're going to connect either in Zouk or in Shihadeh. So
might be fine. The Zouk people will be there.
And they already have it. It's already there.
Yes, you've had your hand for a while.
Yeah, hi, thank you for the study. It's actually very, very interesting. I have two questions. One is related to the maintenance of the generators. Did you see a correlation between air pollution levels and how well or how badly maintained are the generators? So that maybe one of the recommendations would be a more short-term, I don't know, maybe some advices on using how to well-maintain generators or use proper filters, or I mean really short-term solutions. And the second question is, how do you see these results translated for policymakers? I mean, these results are really very interesting. But what are your plans, I don't know, as AUB or as IFI, to translate these results to policymakers and try to really lobby the way you did for the smoking ban, and maybe try to do really something about these generators?
Okay,
go ahead.
The first one? The first one is that if the filters can reduce the emission of these issues. I don't think we should comment on this. I think Dr. Shihadeh was very clear, no matter what you do, they're not going to reduce the emission to zero. I think the best solution is to push ETL to have electricity for everyone, right?
But then it's a very long-term plan. Maintenance, I don't know, maintenance for generators, changing of, if they have filters, changing their filters, maintaining actually the generators.
This is, part of the reluctance
is a hangover from the tobacco control law. We don't want smoking, non-smoking areas, and in the same way, we don't want people to think the problem has been addressed by putting specifications on generators. Really, the solution is to get rid of the generators. They shouldn't be next to where we breathe. So there's some reluctance on our part, I think, because of that. I think Nadine had...
Thanks for the policy aspect of it. We are going to be working with Alan and Najat, as well as with others, public health people and economists, on turning this study into public policy brief, so that that will be disseminated and hopefully made useful to the ministry and to the members of the parliament. So it's not stopping here, we're going to go forward. Hopefully, when we generate enough funds as well, maybe we can continue with other funding of studies that go along with this line.
There is, I mean, just to follow up on Nadine.
Jad Shaban is going to be looking at turning exposure numbers into economic costs, health, estimating increased incidence of specific diseases and the economic costs associated with those, so that it becomes a very clear number for policymakers.
I want to ask you, Dr. Alain, what would trees be able to offer a certain amount of filtration to any of this? Like, especially in the location around the AUB, there's a lot of, it's like a forest basically. Does it offer any filtration?
Trees are unbelievably good at trapping particulate matter.
Is that the leaves have an electric charge which makes them actually attract particulate matter. If you notice, if you have any greenery on your balcony and you try to keep it clean, it's almost impossible. So yes, trees are something, as an engineer, I would feel comfortable recommending we have more trees.
Sorry, just a comment on the policy aspect. It's unfortunate that many AUB professors are still serving as advisors to the Ministry of Energy, while we haven't seen any of these numbers translated into policy in the Ministry of Energy. So I think AUB has to centralize this knowledge and come up with one voice. I don't know if you want to talk about this, but we have several voices still within our profession here, that people lobby for supply generation and for ships, and then at the same time we have different professors saying, well, you should plan it according to the weather and the wind. We haven't seen, I've read Minister Basir, I'm not against this proper minister or the other, it's some politics. It's just that we haven't seen yet any strategy for power generation based on what you just said. Put the power plant where there is this wind configuration. I haven't seen it. I've read the strategy several times, I haven't seen it. So, and I know that several professors from AUB are on the minister's team, and that's a fact. So I don't know if you want to comment on this or not, but I guess one thing for the Assam Fires Institute is to have a unified voice within the faculty, like what happened with the tobacco law. The tobacco law was made possible because we as AUB spoke with one voice. We are not speaking with one voice for electricity generation.
Jad, as you know, we cannot create new sites for power generation right now because of many other issues that we're well aware of. Land appropriation, existing sites, all that do not lend themselves to new sites. The best option, and I'm sure Najat and Alan will have comment on that, is to change the fuel mix that you're using to have less polluting energy production, and to work on demand management, and to work on many, many other aspects. Modeling, excellent, yes, if we're going to be generating, putting up new plants, definitely that should work within that setting. As to having a unified voice, it is within this context that we can have a unified voice on principles rather than just on, doing modeling this versus that. It's not one thing, it's the total. Sum total of it.
Just a comment, a quick question. I'm a physician, and for me, this issue of air pollution is of the utmost importance because of its healthcare consequences. The question I have is, I'm not aware, maybe you can correct me, are there any data in Lebanon on the healthcare consequences in terms of emissions? I know that you mentioned that you are going to be gathering that data. Are there databases in place that gather this information on the prevalence of admissions for asthma incidence, for other lung ailments, for heart diseases, and so on? And my concern is that this is not something that this is an issue that has to be dealt with the utmost. It has to be dealt with emergently. It's not something that can wait. And I hope that there will be measures taken very soon to try to translate it into public policy.
I think the person next to you is the best person to comment on this.
I've been accused of being Islam haven't I? Previously. We know the guidelines, we know the WHO guidelines. Of course, it would be best if we gather data and correlate it with our levels here and shock everybody that these are the effects. But we are all one species, all human beings are one species, and there have been studies about what the effects of these levels are elsewhere. So if the policymakers want to see the numbers only here, I mean, if they don't want to believe the numbers elsewhere, that's their problem, I think. But I think we can do this. We can collect information from hospital admissions, see and correlate the information and do more modeling. But I think what would be more effective is putting a cost to this, like what Najat Saliba will be doing, as urgently as possible in order to address the problem even quicker than probably what a hospital-based case control study would do in order to convince the policymakers. If we want to repeat other studies from elsewhere, we can do that. It will be a little bit costly and it will be a little bit time-consuming, but we know the evidence and it's overwhelming. So we don't need to do more studies in order to generate evidence.
I would like to add to this. I mean, this is one point of view, but there is a group at the AUB MC who are highly interested in tobacco smoke and air pollution particles that are, initiating a group now to look into that, to go in depth into these studies.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment, if I just may say. It's good to have both in tandem because the data from outside, notwithstanding, is very important and it should be translated into immediate blitz and policy, trying to influence policy changes as soon as possible. But also, knowing the mentalities here, it's going to be very important to show some negative effect. That, I'm Lebanese, and I know that the Lebanese worry about only two major things that really worry them: health and money. So if their health is at stake, and they know that their health is at stake, that is your best bet in effective change.
No, I mean, the studies are going to start. Definitely, we don't have baselines, if I'm not mistaken, correct me. We don't really have baselines right now.
I don't know, and probably the best study design would be to really do a case control study, hospital-based case control study, and to check for the effects of these high levels that we're having, because we are really doing bad. I agree.
No more questions for our esteemed lecturers. I'll take this opportunity again to thank Alan and Najat for a wonderful presentation and a great study. It's precursor for many, as we can see here. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank those that have made this event possible, especially Rana Haj, the coordinator of the Climate Change and the Environment Arab World Program. She's been working diligently and bugging poor Alan and Najat all the time with emails one after the other for this and that. So I would like to take the opportunity to thank her and everybody at IFI for helping out and making this a good event. And thanking you all for turning up and participating in our discussion. Thank you.